Wycliffe's Work for England. Chapter 8. By L. Laurenson. Rome attempts to extinguish the light. We saw in a previous chapter that the Commons had repealed Courtney's persecuting edict, but with the deceit to which Rome often descends, the bishops concealed and denied the fact. There were no parliamentary reports in those days, and no daily newspapers. Few would have been able to read them even had they existed. So Courtney determined to use his present authority to purge Oxford if he could. This brings before us some glimpses of others of Wycliffe's friends and followers at Oxford who became his helpers in the work of the gospel. Dr. Nicholas Hereford had learned much from his master at Oxford, and was so ardently convinced of the truths of Scripture which Wycliffe had opened up to him that he thought all men would believe the truth of the gospel as soon as it was put before them. His faith took in even the Pope himself, and he promptly set off to Rome to show him a better way. Alas, he did not know the Pope. Urban VI was no better, and he could hardly be much worse than some of his predecessors. He promptly thrust into a Roman dungeon for life the man who should dare to question Rome's best money-making conceit of transubstantiation. And life with Hereford, if left to the Pope's tender mercies, would have been short indeed. But the city that was governed by the successor of St. Peter and the Vicar of Christ, as the Holy Father loved to call himself, was possibly the worst governed city upon the face of the earth. The miserable inhabitants, goaded ofttimes to fury, made periodical risings against their Holy Father, stormed his castles and emptied his prisons. Such a rising took place after Hereford had been 2 years in captivity, and he, having escaped as a bird from the snare of the fowler, wended his way back to England, a sadder and a wiser man. But he could not now go back to his lecture room at Oxford, so he joined Aston and some others of the brethren in the West. We are grieved to find that this man, who in his early zeal aimed at converting the Pope himself, after preaching the Reformed doctrines for some years, made his peace with the Church and rose to high preferment. Do these last 4 words convey the reason of his falling away from the truth? Only grace can keep anyone. Let us not judge him. The paths of these early confessors were spread with thorns, and to all is not given the courage to resist unto blood striving against sin. John Aston, Master of Arts, was another of those who were brought up before Courtney as one who troubled Israel, and one who had cost the Bishop of Lincoln many a sleepless night. Now if the good bishop had been as anxious to put the truth before the people as he was to keep it from them, he would have had our sympathy, but this was far from being the case. Dr. Aston is described by his enemies as a man of great scholarship and of ardent zeal and earnest effort, but his efforts in preaching the gospel to the people were not at all to the liking of his enemies. They said he was like a bee, always on the wing, or like a hound, ever ready to start up from his repose and bark. And the bishops did not like Aston's bark. There was a menacing ring in it that spelled the downfall of their power and pride. There was an echo to it that made the walls of their princely palaces to shake. The question against him was again the old fable of transubstantiation. This was the keystone of their arch on which all their power over men's consciences was built. Were this knocked down, many other things would follow. So Aston was called upon to answer to certain questions in relation to this doctrine, and he replied that his faith on this subject was the faith of the Church, meaning the true faith of the true Church. Then, speaking no longer to his judges, but to the great congregation of people who had crowded in to watch the proceedings, he declared what the true faith of the true Church was, until he was hastily called to order, and commanded to speak in Latin that the people might not understand him. In the end his opinions were condemned, as we should expect, but as yet the bishops had no power to arrest his person, so this long lean man went forth again to travel on foot from one part of England to another, preaching with the zeal of an apostle, and like a bee ever on the wing. Like a bee, also, he carried a sweet message of truth and grace to many a heart tired of the penances, pilgrimages, and works of merit, which could give neither peace to the conscience nor rest to the heart. It was a new and a joyful sound to hear of one who could say, "Come unto me, and I will give you rest." And there were many who received and rejoiced in the newfound truths. Beginning at Lutterworth, which was Wycliffe's parish, as a centre, we find the new doctrines extending north through Leicester, Loughborough, and Nottingham. Going west there were many of Wycliffe's followers found in Coventry, in Worcester where the poor bishop had so many sleepless nights, and in Hereford. Further south the light spread to Gloucester, Berkshire, Wiltshire, and in the extreme south Sussex also came under its influence. Even in the Archbishop's own town of Canterbury were found many who had passed out of the darkness of Rome into the light of the gospel. Nor must we overlook the life and work of Dr. John Privet, who was one of Wycliffe's closest friends, and who rendered valuable help with Bible translation, as we shall see later. Possibly Privet was one of the most able and learned men among the early reformers, and when Wycliffe and his friends were finally expelled from Oxford, Privet resided at Lutterworth and helped in the publication, if not even in the writing, of the many books and tracts issued during the closing years of Wycliffe's life. The efforts of the latter during these closing years must have been incessant and untiring. Over 90 tracts and pamphlets were issued in Latin for the learned, and some 65 in English for the common people. Some were written as instruction for his poor priests, some dealing with the way of salvation, many, as we should expect, attacking the manifold errors both of the Pope and of the Papacy. After Wycliffe's death, Privet joined some others of the company of poor priests in the West, and continued the work of evangelization. The little community were residing in an old disused chapel, where there still remained a wooden image of St. Catherine standing in a corner. Finding themselves short of fuel one cold evening, they pulled down the image and promptly split it up for firewood. When knowledge of this terrible act of sacrilege came abroad, it caused a great sensation, as we might have expected. But it also led people to think, why should they worship stocks and stones as pagans do? Were they not, in name at least, Christians? So the fire lighted by the broken fragments of St. Catherine helped to shed additional light, both on the errors of Rome and into the minds of the people. We meet with Privet again nearly 20 years later. There is another fire before him, this time more fierce than that kindled by St. Catherine. At this time, 1401, the crafty Arundel had succeeded in getting the Act de Heretico Comparendo placed on the statute book, and William Sautre, the first of England's modern martyrs, was wrapped to glory in a chariot of flame. He had dared to say to the priests, "I will worship Christ who died on the cross, but I will not worship the cross on which Christ died." 3 days after Sautre had gained the martyr's crown, we listened sadly to Dr. John Privet reading a recantation, at St. Paul's Cross, of all he had said and done. And so the old man passes into the shadows. As far as we can trace, he was the last of the Oxford scholars that had originally gathered round the reformer, but they had done their work. The seeds of truth they had sown bore fruit in the next generation. The banner of truth had been raised, and though many standard-bearers fell on the field of conflict, others were found to grasp what soon became indeed a blood-stained banner and bear it on to victory. The death fires which were first lighted in 1401 continued to burn till 1558, and never more fiercely than during the last 6 years of that period. Men and women, even boys and girls, sealed their testimony with their blood. To read the Scriptures or even to possess a Bible was considered a crime only to be expiated at the dreadful stake. Tortures, conceivable only by men inspired by the devil himself, were inflicted on delicate women until their poor bodies were so maimed and broken that they had to be carried to the death fire and chained erect to the post. Men had their feet burned to the bone, and were then put in the stocks the night before they were to die, in order to add to their sufferings. All these things were done by the priests of Rome, and all these things were suffered by the martyrs of Jesus. We, today, have our liberties as the result.